without further ado, I will turn the table over to Alden.
Yeah, but we're not at the same table.
The table, it's the proverbial metaphysical table.
When State College suddenly started having direct flights to Chicago, some of us started thinking about the possibilities this opened up to us. And one of the first people I thought of was today's speaker, Jennifer Scappetone, from the University of Chicago. I'm going to try to make this brief. The first I became aware of Jennifer was in the poetry world, where I began to see her giving readings and started following her poems in magazines, and particularly with this early little chapbook, Residence. The other thing I learned from this chapbook is that she likes to give books titles that I have a hard time pronouncing. There's also this really wonderful book from the Belladonna publishers, which startled me because Jennifer appeared in the Belladonna Elders series, which had me concerned for a moment, until I realized that what this series is a younger poet introducing and interacting with people who've been influential in their own work in one way or another. And in this case, it's Attila Adnan and the wonderful Benedictine. Then we come to this really beautiful volume from Dame Quickly. Those of you who've studied her marks probably recognize this persona, but the rest of you might want to look at the epigraph of the book. From Litmus Press. Really, really just gorgeous book. You start to see what Jennifer is also doing with visual work in this book. You also saw that in the one from Belladonna. She's been doing these really interesting collage pieces with existing text and making poems out of them. The first I was aware of this actually was when we had I keep turning as if you're here, but you're here. We had a 20th anniversary marking of the infamous MLA offsite readings that Jennifer participated in, and she had some of this visual work on her computer and was reading it and sort of trying to show us what these things look like at the same time. She's also done important work as a translator, and I would recommend to you Locomotrix, a bilingual edition, selected poetry and prose of Amelia Roselli. And getting closer to the topic of today, there's a phenomenon I'm really interested in that's related to a phenomenon I despise. Any of you who've been to conferences have heard people get up and say, "I've changed my title"? I'd be much happier hearing someone just say,
my length.
Yeah, I've been more impressed if they just said, "I've changed my paper," and kept the title. But title changes are kind of interesting. When the Washington Post first sent me Paul Gilroy's now best-known book to review, it was in Bound Galleys, and it was called Promised Lands. And I can't help but think how different American literary studies might have been if it had stayed Promised Lands and then not become the Black Atlantic. If you're an inveterate reader of the backs of books and copyright pages like I am, you would discover that her monograph was at one time called The Amphibious City, Venice and the Digressive Invention of the Modern. That's when it was in progress. It now exists. And I'm going to pass this around actually because there's some gorgeous color plates in here. Killing the Moonlight, Modernism in Venice, which brings us to the topic of today's talk, and this is Jennifer Scappetone.
Thank you for coming out in the middle of the day on a lovely Monday, and thank you very much, Alden, for the invitation, and Jonathan for hosting me too. My title today is From Corpse to Specter, Venice as Antagonist and Emblem of Modernity. We repudiate antique Venice, exhausted and undone by centuries-old voluptuousnesses, which even we once loved and possessed in a grand nostalgic dream. We repudiate the Venice of outsiders, market of fakers and antiquarians, magnet of snobbery and of universal imbecility, bed unbottomed by caravans of lovers, hip bath garnished for cosmopolite courtesans, cloaca maxima of passeism. We want to heal and cicatrize this putrescent city, magnificent sore of the past. We want to prepare for the birth of an industrial and military Venice that would dominate the Adriatic Sea, great Italian lake. Let us rush to fill the small, stinking canals with the ruins of the crumbling and leprous old palaces. Let us burn the gondolas, rocking easy chairs for idiots, and erect the imposing geometry of metallic bridges and factories pluming with smoke to the sky to abolish the falling curves of old architectures. Let the rain of divine electric light come to liberate Venice from its venal moonlight of furnished rooms. When in 1910, F.T. Marinetti and comrades airbombed crowds arriving from the Lido's new beach resorts with 800,000 copies of the Futurist Manifesto against Passeist Venice from the clock tower of St. Mark's Square, symbolically hijacking the timekeeping function of the medieval clock tower being pathetically reconstructed as it was, where it was, across the plaza. They ushered the burgeoning leisure class into a new accelerated tempo and defined the futurist mission in unprecedentedly concrete terms. The manifesto against Venice dropped in this seminal happening, which launched a decades-long socio-aesthetic campaign and manner of making art, forms the futurists' first would-be urban plan. It calls on Venetians to destroy the decrepit curves of the city of lagoons and to erect the imposing geometry of an industrial port in their place, sealing off Venice's signature influx from afar phantasmatically to make of the Adriatic Sea a great Italian lake. Efforts to modernize the city, whose slow erosion was darling to foreign romantics and decadent aesthetes, had been debated locally for 2 decades, and from 1917 forward, capitalist impresarios were to develop the port of Marghera as the lung of Venetian modernity. Yet the performative force of the futurist tractates does more to drive Venice into the rhetoric and epos of the modern than any piecemeal effort of modernization. The Nuova Venezia, wrought imaginatively by futurist polemics, struck such a resounding chord that today's Venetians view the port and petrochemical plants as Marinetti's dream realized. Launched on the heels of Daniel Burnham's 1909 plan of Chicago, the futurist scheme to cicatrize Venice ushers the 19th century urban ideal of Haussmann's Paris being implemented internationally into a cityscape particularly unaccommodating to such blueprints, as well as to later fascist campaigns of sventramento, or urban disembowelment, in the service of an aesthetic program of romanità, or romanity. Venice is an archipelago that sits in a lagoon dissociated from the mainland of northern Italy and protected from the Adriatic Sea by a series of barrier islands. It was founded upon quagmires and planted upon such unfirm Moorish and spongy foundations out of necessity, as a Venetian historian of the 16th century puts it. Popular tradition has it that the islands were settled by Romans fleeing the invading Huns and were built up by centuries of collaboration with environmental flux, every day altering and changing according to the tides of the sea. Human intervention modified the wetlands' ecological balance over time while maintaining a delicate equilibrium. Identified in the plural on early maps, what we call Venice was once a loose configuration of island cells, or insulae, rendered singular by the consolidation of marshes between the end of the first millennium and the 14th century. In 1560, Francesco Sansovino described the transition between city zones as a continual process of adaptation and estrangement. Quote, Venice shows itself to be not only one, but many cities, separated and all conjoined at once in such a manner that exiting one quarter and entering another, you will say without a doubt that you are exiting one city and entering another, with the infinite ease of the inhabitants and the stupefaction of foreigners, unquote. In the discontinuous texture of superimposed canals and calli, or alleyways for pedestrians, we still encounter seams between the original island parishes that were never aligned by rational planning once reclamation filled in their liquid divisions. Though the archipelago was connected to the mainland by rail in the mid-19th century and by an automobile bridge in the 1930s, The paradoxical harmony among discordant nuclei still conditions an emotion through the Venice of today. The discordant harmony of Venice has inspired countless eulogies and polemics, the past century and a half of which I recently spent a decade and a half attempting to track. Why train one's attention on the last 150 years of intellectual and aesthetic engagement with Venice when, due to the extraordinary geographical constraints, few subsequent interventions have altered its structure and pace, while the forms of most cities, even medieval ones like Paris and Barcelona, have changed utterly? Why pause in a reputedly decadent backwater when, as commonplace has it, Venice has constituted no center of new artistic production since the fall of the Venetian Republic to Napoleon in 1797? These were questions often put to me when I first set out upon this project, just following the bicentennial anniversary of the Republic's fall. The initial answer is straightforward, though its exegesis can become rather convoluted. Venice compels attention precisely because the city rebukes the injunctions of the new that govern both modern cities and art, as this non-compliance drives artists and theorists through unruly byways in cognition and the construction of form. Insofar as modernity is defined by the myth of a radical break with the past, Venice persists as an exemplary aberration. Not only does it prove unaccommodating to any unfettered destruction of historical form or imposition of the new, but it operates according to material constraints rather than the classical figures and geometries privileged by the selective memory nostalgia of modernist artists and planners. While the medieval mazes of Paris, London, or Dublin are historically contingent, Venice's very foundations are labyrinthine. Italo Calvino calls Venice the first anti-Euclidean city. Once the heart of the city was consolidated as a fish-shaped complex around the beginning of the 14th century, all further development was conditioned by the need to reutilize the existing foundations, which had been laid out at great cost with wood, bricks, and stone, imported by river, lagoon, and sea. And here's just one example of what I'm talking about, Santa Maria Formosa. This is originally a 7th century structure, and when it was reconstructed in the style essentially of the Renaissance of the late Quattrocento, they just added a facade, but essentially the Byzantine layout of the church remains the same. So you can see that kind of mismatch in this building itself. Lagoon inhabitants were obliged into adaptive reuse, both of these foundations and of existing architraves, capitals, cornices, and columns fabricated in different places and periods, so that even when buildings were renovated during the Renaissance and beyond, they retained a certain Byzantine shape or an odd eclecticism of languages and styles. The urban fabric is thus inherently anachronistic and polycultural. Being hybrid in its foundations, decentralized, and bound to a reciprocal relationship with natural and cultural influx, Venice balks at the design ideals of classical and Renaissance Rome, ideals revivified to global consequence in the planning of Haussmann's Paris of the Second Empire, and in the only partially realized Via Imperiali, imperial roads of fascism. It thus forces us to reconceive of the relationship between the city of the long 20th century and its would-be flaneurs. As a fissured, labyrinthine, amphibious complex, Venice presents unique aesthetic, intellectual, and socio-political opportunities and, above all, constraints. While those constraints have led to an obvious blockage of modernist building, Venice's resistance to the modern from the 16th century forward can be viewed as itself a driving force toward the future. For the great architectural historian and theorist Manfredo Tafuri, who claims outright that there is no progress or development in the field of modernity without the constant spur of those who have negated the modern, Venice offers, quote, a form of time in which mixtures are not obstructive, and goes on to claim, it is precisely insofar as they are mixed, insofar as they are dialectical, that they move forward. This is the ultimate critique that one can launch at the accelerated chronographic time of contemporaneity. Venice represents a negation that Tafuri identifies as the load-bearing motor of modernity. Only once this negation ceases to launch its challenge to Hegelian syntheses driving toward progress does Venice become a corpse. Venice's constraints, indeed, led to a waxing of imagination in the period when modernist architecture flourished internationally, taking shape in a number of definitive, though unbuilt, projects. Perhaps the most exemplary of these is Le Corbusier's plan for the hospital at San Giobbe, which encapsulated several decades of the architect's fascination with Venice. It conceived of the hospital as part of the city fabric, incorporating the alleyways and courtyard-like public spaces of Venice into the plan. It fell by the wayside, being judged alien to its context. Note the contrast between curvaceous Venice and the modernist grid a la Mondrian's Broadway boogie-woogie. But activated Peter Eisenman later to reconstruct it as if it had been built, and to call the design one of the last anguishes of heroic modernism, symbolizing the failure of modernism's remedial ideology, expressing the poignant wish that a modernist hospital could heal the city whose liquid vulnerability led to so many meditations on illness and death in the first half of the 20th century. In a more recent work, the Spanish artist Dionisio González brings out the contrast between Le Corbusier's strong vision of healing and the weak conformist architecture that actually does get built. My research explores myriad such projections and shows how any engagement with Venice must contend with a long literary tradition invoking Venice as a metaphor for glory or decay. As Venice, Venus, the feminized instrument of the most serene city's native political agendas, or Venice whore, Venice, receptrix of all foulnesses, in Boccaccio's words, the splendid, corrupt matrix of foreign sexual political fantasies, from Machiavelli to Otway to Daphne du Maurier and Ian McEwan. My aim has been to look beyond instrumental literary invocations of the city as symbol or as backdrop, instead treating the urban complex as active ambience, as actuality. This is a difficult task in reckoning with any historical city, but I try to show it is particularly challenging in a site so encrusted with centuries of narcissistic signatures. In his post-Nietzschean Venetian meditation on the uses and disadvantages of living among specters, Giorgio Agamben writes of living in a Venice that is no longer a cadaver, such as the one imagined in many Death in Venice scenarios, but rather a specter. Though he does not give specific reasons why, he points to the Venice of projected World's Fairs reproached by Tafuri, where the speculations and depredations of the culture and tourism industries have hollowed out the potential of quotidian life. Both Agamben and Tafuri nevertheless describe Venice as whispering in sounds unbearable to the modern ear, creaking and sending unintelligible signals without warning. The specter for Agamben is a cluster of signs, of ciphers, of monograms etched into things over time, and living in Venice is like, quote, trying to pronounce every word syllable by syllable in a dead language, learning how to lose and rediscover our way in the bottlenecks of declensions and sudden openings of supines and future infinitives, unquote. Modernist poetics that take shape in the spectral city bolster Agamben's contention that one should never declare a language dead because it still speaks somehow and is read. They only show that, quote, it is only impossible or nearly impossible to assume the position of a subject in such a language, of the one who says, I, unquote. In contouring the city's waxing material against myriad subjective designs, I have had to reckon with modernism's blockage in Venice. The subtitle of my book echoes Thomas Mann's Death in Venice, but displaces death with modernism. It also suggests that modernism did not really gain a foothold in Venice despite manifold attempts. Instead, deflected modernist impulses became part of the assemblage, like so much else in Venice. Venice permits us to explore the aspirations, critiques, repressions, and failures of both modernity as development and ideology, and modernism as aesthetic response. When the ecological damage inflicted by Port Marghera and other modernizing campaigns begins to show through apocalyptic flooding in the post-war period, and modern notions of progress in turn become obsolete, the city of lagoons, being as perennially open to industrial contaminants as it has been to organic influx, can be seen to host a discomfiting marriage of its famed stones with the detritus of modernizing campaigns. And this is Rob Pruitt's installation at Palazzo Grassi, art idea number 97, write captions on the glass for the view outside your window, in which he details all of the toxins that are to be found in this storied body of water, the Grand Canal, just beyond the glass. In a 1976 essay provocatively titled Venice, Perhaps, the poet Andrea Zanzotto, a Veneto native, overturns centuries of romanticization by bringing its coagulation of primordial beauty and post-industrial sludge to the fore. In Zanzotto's post-utopian handling, this corner of the Adriatic reveals its status as a poor well clotted with sewage, where the purest mother of pearl fuses with the equivocal iridium of industrial dejecta. While rendering the costs of modernization trenchantly clear, the lagoon's contents also literalize the challenge of reconciling this fabled cityscape with an incommensurable ambient temporality, or, quote, of framing certain fundamental exigencies of today's rhythms and production with something that is too far past to be conserved or too far in the future to be reinvented, unquote. Whether lodged conceptually in the distant past or the distant future, the city of Venice has stood since the dawn of modernity as an anachronism in the cultural imagination. The pre-modern complex on the lagoon resists any uniform present tense and, in turn, any 20th century effort to mold it into a more rational urban whole. Though the futurists launched their founding call to kill the moonlight of romantic Venice as early as 1909, the swarms of tourists who still seek the moonlit locus of popular imagery, literature, and song, from Antonio Lamberti's 1788 La Biondina in Gondoletta to Madonna's 1984 Like a Virgin, continue to demand that Venice remain a refuge of the past, frozen in time, able to be touched for the very first time. These futurist and passéist desires, though opposing, are equally phantasmatic. And this is an interesting moment in the Like a Virgin video, in which Madonna is in New York City at night by the light of the moon. She gets on a boat and she finds herself in sunny Venice. So Venice isn't actually lit by moonlight, but it's the New York lit by moonlight that enables her to magically transition from kind of a little motorboat to a gondola, to kind of straddle it and make the canals sort of openly contend with the sexualization of the cityscape of Venice filled with channels. Being both hostile to the designs of modern urbanism and incompletely obsolete, Venice is a radically anachronistic city. It aggravates 20th century schemes to isolate the present and future from their precedents, while continuing to elude any historical narrative that would settle the meaning of the city's past or determine the trajectory of its future. These are the bombardments of Venice by Austro-German planes during World War I as of the 15th of March, 1919. So the idea that Venice has remained kind of completely detached from the phenomena of the 20th century is really a myth. So this map just kind of shows that. Each dot is a bomb that fell on the city. Venice has never been removed from international political and aesthetic trends and economies, but rather reflects shadows and derails them. And yet the historic city of lagoons has represented a rebuke to modernity for artists and intellectuals since the dawn of Enlightenment. It has become a point of obsession for those seeking to delineate and explore the conceptual borders of modernism, both early and late. It was in relation to the 1980 Venice Biennial of Architecture, the world's first freestanding international architecture exhibition, credited with introducing postmodernism to a broad, non-specialist audience for the first time, that Jürgen Habermas was compelled to define and defend the rationalism of aesthetic modernity. Anachronistic Venice formed an apt environment for an exhibition that represented the sacrifice of the modern tradition, as Habermas would lament. Titled The Presence of the Past and installed in the historic arsenal, which was remodeled and opened dramatically to the public for the first time in its 800-year history, the architectural biennial emblematized the dawning of a movement that would rummage through the spectral forms of history. Its central exhibit featured a strada novissima, or latest street, of 20 facade fantasies constructed to scale in wood, paper mache, and plaster, with leading architects from Venturi, Rausch, and Scott Brown to Hans Hollein offering wildly synchronic pastiches of historical shapes and styles. The faux facades were fabricated by the studios of Cinecittà, the center of the film industry in Rome. Their disparately styled and mock-spoliated columns, masonry types, and entrance thresholds realized the wistful reawakening of the street as a rebuke to the heroic modernist enterprise, generating heated debate across Europe and the Atlantic. And this is Hans Hollein's facade in the middle is particularly interesting. There are columns. There's, a standard column on the left. Then there's a reference to Loos's project for the Chicago Herald Tribune, a column supporting nothing, a column covered with vines to indicate the environmental crisis, and the 1576 primitivist trunk of Philibert Delorme. So to put these all together in one facade system really provided a kind of shock to the public, and it was really very successful in getting the public to understand what this postmodernism was really about. Habermas opened his seminal acceptance speech for the Adorno Prize with a poignant suspicion of this avant-garde of reversed fronts that, quote, sacrificed the tradition of modernity in order to make room for a new historicism, unquote. On this occasion, Habermas famously set himself against the Frankfurt School's critique of Enlightenment, whose writings against rationalist, triumphalist historicism clarify the renewed pull of Venice on a post-war generation of intellectuals. Against the new historicism on display in Venice, Habermas identified in the modern impulse, quote, the longing for an undefiled, immaculate, and stable present, unquote. It was not by chance that both Marinetti in 1910 at the dawn of modernism and Habermas in 1980 at the dawn of postmodernism were drawn to define the modern through and against Venice. Despite the wistful visions of modernization of the futurists and their belated inheritors, here imagining a freeway over the overpass over the lagoon just days before the historic flood in 1966, modernism had always been subject to stress in a city that, in Tafuri's words, even being cadaverous as it is today, launches an intolerable provocation to the world of modernity. Any quest to usher the city of lagoons into a purely present tense or even to harmonize its histories is frustrated by the mediation of centuries of inscription on the one hand and on the other by structural features of the cityscape itself, a topographical ambiguity or amphibiousness that retains natural features associated with the primordial, and an architectonic obliquity and digression that thwart any Cartesian viewpoint or projection onto the whole. Marinetti's ruthless 1910 scheme and its reprisal in the bombardments of an unpublished theatrical work, reconstructing Italy with Sant'Elian futurist architecture from the late 20s to early 30s, reflected a pervasive frustration with Venice, its resistance to sintesi or synthesis, visible, spatial, and social. Jacopo de Barbari had fashioned a monumental panorama of the archipelago as early as 1500, gathering the work of many surveyors to manufacture a composite bird's-eye view. Yet to those unpossessed of such an aid, the labyrinth deflects synthesizing gazes, continuing to bend at odds against the modern French ideal of a direct legibility of space and masses. Marinetti yokes its spatial obscurity anxiously to bodily channels in disprising the city who, like a procuress wearing a heavy mantle of mosaics, insists on offering us veiled women at every crepuscular turn of her canals. Though Marinetti may be the most bombastic of enemies to all the diseased literature and endless romantic fantastication draped over the city by poets poisoned with what he called the Venetian fever, John Ruskin was the first and most vehement to refute the romantic legacy of Venice and to produce turbulent, nonlinear histories in the process. He admits in The Stones of Venice, 1851 to 53, that it can be tempting to disavow the depredations of modern Venice. The construction of a railway bridge in 1846 made the fabled transition from land to lagoon, here pictured by Turner in 1844, barely perceptible, so that, quote, the noble landscape of approach to her can now be seen only by a glance as the engine slackens its rushing on the iron line. Ruskin argues implicitly that we too must approach the city through new channels, like it or not. Many a hurried traveler will be inclined to disguise what is discordant in this scene, but Ruskin grants no permission to such obfuscations. Quote, impotent feelings of romance may indeed gild, but never save the remains of those mightier ages, and they must be torn away from the magnificent fragments if we would see them. The Venice of modern fiction and drama is a thing of yesterday, a stage dream which the first ray of daylight must dissipate into dust, unquote. If we are to discern anything at all in Venice, we must emancipate the city in fragments from the lugubriously sentimental stage dream of romanticism. True engagement obliges us to view magnificent Venice as a complex of objects, however damaged, in the brutal light of the present. Only then can these objects become touchstones of a world that would counter our own. In inventing the avant-garde half a century later, Marinetti echoes Ruskin's call for the merciless illumination of Venice, calling upon citizens to kill the moonlight that pervades popular representations, though he appends an imperative to fill the canals with the ruins of the leprous old palaces themselves, sodden with romanticism. Let the rain of divine electric light come to liberate Venice from its venal moonlight. The careers of these demagogic figures could not seem more opposed to one another. In fact, Ruskin lamented the city's introduction of gaslight in 1845, quote, which Venice provides for your seeing her shop wares by night against your seeing the moon, unquote, while Marinetti blamed Ruskin for having singularly developed the obsessive cult of our past in Europe. However dissimilar, these authors pursue a common end which appropriates the rhetoric of Enlightenment and becomes central to the scheme of modernism. By striking Venice with the light of day and electricity, respectively, they seek to collapse romantic distance from the place, to regard the city as material, however distressed, in the present tense. Their aspiration toward objectivity aims to restore to the discordant material at hand a radiant presence, even if their hopes and methods for arriving at presence are diametrically opposed. The aspiration to revive Venice by subjecting romantic falsehoods to the light of the current day has yielded a century and a half of aesthetic experimentation, whose struggle deserves its own chapter in the history of modernism. Venice becomes the locus par excellence in which to contend with traces of the past that foil the quest for presence Habermas locates at the heart of modernism, and ultimately to recover a vitally nonlinear form of historicity, wherein the pressure to recuperate the past for present purposes gives rise to countless filtrations and detours. And I'll just flash here something that I discuss in my 4th chapter, which is the first publication of cantos 17 to 27 of Ezra Pound, which contained these illuminations, very much in the shadow of William Morris's Kelmscott Press, although Pound insisted that it wasn't. And the illuminations by Gladys Hines are really quite interesting, and of course they've been completely ignored by the critical record, apart from a few writings by Jerome McGann and one or two others. Even Marinetti, would-be eradicator of the Venetian labyrinth, fell subject to the drama of Venice's sumptuous mediation. Few would have guessed in 1910 that his last major work would return to the Venetian cityscape to envision its reconstruction in the form of a baroquely embellished female colossus of Murano glass. And this is a very poor quality image, but it's just an image since the text has no illustrations of the cover by Benedetta Cappa Marinetti, Marinetti's wife. They took her motorboat painting and put it on the cover of this work that was from 1943 to 44, but it was only published in 2014. It lay sitting there for all of these years due to Marinetti's kind of falling out with the cultural avant-garde for good reason. For those of you who don't know what Murano glass looks like, you've probably heard of it, but just to give you an example of how bizarre it is that Marinetti would have turned to Murano glass for stylistic reasons, but he imagines a futurist work being created of this material. In 1943 to 44, when in his late 60s and damaged physically by fighting on the Russian front, the founder of Futurism took refuge in the relatively unbombarded archipelago. In the midst of a world and now civil war, he produced a self-described aero novel or aero poem that renders Venice and its traditional decorative elaboration, glass, a medium of would-be social healing, though figuration of the city instead comes to constitute a receptacle for the refuse of the fascist colonial dream, now amalgamated with the traces of past histories. This long dormant work complicates our picture of the futurist's relation to literary and political history, lodging his avant-garde ideals in a brutally compromised wartime scenario. Dictated to his wife and daughters in his final year of life, Venezianella e Studentaccio envisions a nuovissima Venezia in the form of an inhabitable colossus of the uttermost historicist kitsch, reconstructed by futurist glassblowers. The skirt of Venezianella, the futurist, is composed of myriad San Marcos, her breastplate an immense ducal palace, her bonnet an enlarged form of the Ca d'Oro, a beloved Gothic palace on the Grand Canal. Marinetti's aero text adopts the lightness, velocity, perspectival diffuseness, and shifts of scale characteristic of flight to recompose the city of lagoons as a teeming amalgam of sweet simultaneity. A dazzling, discomposing mosaic effect is the result. In this work, Marinetti as fascist demagogue turns himself inside out. Mediated on stylistic, generic, and material fronts, Venezianella engages history as an amassment of filters, blockages, and encrustations through which the living must bore in order to renew society. Writing from within the tenuous asylum of a Venice hemmed in by war, Marinetti is assailed with the tortuous roots of cultural inheritance. His late text expresses that a new day for the city and the nation can only be erected by navigation through pre-existent forms, signatures, and residua. Out of endless battle comes volatile coagulation with the past. In the translation I'm working on now, and about which I can talk more in a minute if there's interest during the Q&A. I hope to intervene in the stultifying temporal narrative of fascism, its endgame, with all moments pointing toward an authoritarian presenza or presence. And this is the sacrarium to fascist martyrs from the 10th anniversary of the fascist march on Rome. I'd like to close with a quote from Agamben that points to the utility of living among Venetian specters and of studying them. What the Specter argues with its choir boy-like voice is that if all the cities and the languages of Europe now survive only as phantasms, then only to those who have learned to become intimate and familiar with these phantasms, reciting and committing to memory their discarnate words and stones, will that breach perhaps one day reopen in which history, life, abruptly fulfills its promises. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I was just going to say, I realized that I worked almost in a montage kind of style, trying to condense, and so I realized that I flashed a lot of images up there that I didn't talk about, and I didn't unpack this quote, so all of this is fodder for further questions, obviously, or anything else that you might want to ask of me.
Well, just to lead things off, thank you very much for your talk, and actually for its montage-like quality, which grounds us in that kind of, set of constraints on one hand, but also the particularity that you use to approach this topic, as opposed to the continuing the rampant speculation and fantasy. But I'm going to do precisely that in some ways. I'm struck by how this work, precisely through its particularity, becomes available as a kind of allegory for a certain kind of epistemological approach, right? So the work that you're describing, sort of non-recuperative, not fully recuperatable dialectic, emphasizes the resistance of the object in these ways. And I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about that, to extrapolate upon that again more broadly without risking over hyper-speculation. Talk about, I'm really struck by the epistemological nature of this work. That's one angle, and I think also it has to do a little bit with a kind of geopolitical possibility too. I mean, the archipelagated thought seems to be very much a geopolitical mode, which Venice strikes into as well, as a kind of gateway, right?
Yes.
So I think there's really a compelling story to be told, only if you sacrifice the particularity of Venice, but maybe if you would say about that.
Right, so you mean in terms of the speculation and sacrificing Venice's particularity, you just mean that you would like to hear me talk about how this could be applied beyond the case of Venice. Yes, okay. So right, although it was spurred by Venice for its particular form, which is so material that you can't actually make a blueprint for it. I mean, there are only tiny little stretches of the city that will accommodate a blueprint. And in fact, Mussolini did do one little thing. He made a little promenade, but it's just a promenade on one side of the city. And so I started this project out when I was working on a modern poetry course as a graduate student studying the cantos, and at the same time was doing a travel literature about Italian travel writing, which started with Marco Polo and ended with Italo Calvino at Berkeley. And we read Massimo Cacciari's L'Arcipelago. So it's a book called The Archipelago by Massimo Cacciari, who was twice the mayor of Venice, but is also an important philosopher. And in fact, you could call him a geo-philosopher interested in urbanism. And he was working at the IUAV, or the Institute of Architecture in Venice, where Agamben also worked for a period, where Manfredo Tafuri worked, where Aldo Rossi worked. And this was a kind of hotbed of radical thinking from the 60s through the early 90s, but it sort of continues to have a legacy. And Massimo Cacciari at the time this was in the 90s. Europe was a new idea. The European Union was this new idea, and it was kind of utopian at the time. And so he was thinking through how Venice as an archipelago, he never says this, but he was thinking about how Venice as an archipelago could form a kind of allegory for the European Union, with the different countries all being a kind of island, and they're all both bound and differentiated by the sea, which is a fluid medium that enables transportation or translation. So that work got me to thinking about the cantos as an archipelagic structure, and I started thinking about this more and more as an allegory of politics as a kind of formal structure. And I was also working with T.J. Clark on description and art writing, and we were reading Ruskin, and Ruskin's late work in particular is just the craziest writing. I really recommend it. We were reading his open letters to the workmen and laborers of Great Britain, Fors Clavigera, and Ruskin is writing about a Venice in which steamships are starting to come in. And so for him, it's hard for us to imagine, but the black smoke of the steamers, if we go back to this image from the Visconti adaptation of Death in Venice, well, this too, the petrol tanker in this, okay, so this kind of thing would have been deeply disturbing when Venice had been a place where you just got around by manual labor of, the arms and hands. And I became interested in the way that Ruskin would stop his writing and would kind of narrate that the steamer was screeching and he had to stop writing. And so his writing directly reflected what was happening on the outside. And it was fascinating because he was actually trying to describe a painting called The Dream of Saint Ursula, which it takes place in a bedroom, and it's a perfect sort of interior isolated space of a saint. And yet the steamship keeps like piercing this wonderful repose of Saint Ursula. So I became interested in Ruskin's, this radical epistemology of Ruskin, and thinking that we could trace a different kind of modernism that was that was not about the art object, aloof, cutting its fingernails, above the work, hovering above the work, the artist hovering above the work, cutting his fingernails, but the work as thoroughly immersed in the tumult of the present moment. And I've gone on way too long, so I can say more, but I hope that begins to answer.
It's not just sort of a sign of the past, as in, the same way as, some rural area, that it's a place that is actually very fundamental to the origin of capitalism.
Yes.
And a very different model of capitalism than what happens in the fascist period, or decentralization, so I'm wondering, so it seems to me like, I don't know, one of the subtexts of your talk is that it's, the modernist fascination with it has to do with this sort of anxiety about their own history. Right, that like they're going to be old someday, right? That this is not. I don't know if that's what you would say, but that's sort of what what I was gathering from it. But so I'm wondering how their relationship with Venice, say, would how it compares to the sort of primitivist fascination, say, like with Africa, or something.
Yes.
Seen as totally outside of
Yes, that interests me quite a lot. There is, I had been reading George van den Abele's work on internal others and in travel narrative, and Venice is a kind of internal other to Europe, not to Italy, because it's so different from Rome, but also to Europe, because it's imagined by many Europeans as existing on the threshold of the East. So, and you think about Shylock, you think about Othello, these are others that have gotten in through Venice because of their trading wiles. You know, I mean, they were open. Hey, you want to do trade with us? Great. I mean, this is how they amassed their wealth. I mean, they also amassed it through the Crusades and a different kind of intercultural exchange. But it fascinates me that Venice is like Africa or India. So if you go back and read Thomas Mann's Death in Venice again, Aschenbach is having these fantasies of going to a swamp, going to this swampy region that's sort of vaguely India, and then he ends up in Venice. So he ends up in the hyper-civilized version of the swamp. So it's this contradiction, this paradox of extreme refinement, which is almost sort of uncivil in that way because it's just overly sumptuous in the leggenda nera, or the negative myth surrounding Venice, which was fabricated by its enemies. And then also the primitivism of the swamp. And that's very much what Marinetti is tapping into also, and because he, having grown up in Alexandria, the son of these people that had gone to make their fortune, there always claims a kind of Africanity. And so it's actually a little more complicated than it seems. He remains this raging imperialist, Italian imperialist, but he also has this identification with Africa. And so he starts writing to the Venetians and imagining that they could sort of strip away all the romantic fantastication and imagine the islands as these as a prehistoric lagoon, and that would be better. It'd be a tabula rasa in which you could make an industrial port that would make Italy great. So I think I've maybe begun to gesture at all the paradoxes there. Yes?
So in this very rich tapestry of image and voice and text that you wove in your talk, I sort of was perceiving a lack of agency in the sense of the Venetians themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Now, whatever that means, the Venetians. Now, maybe some of the artists' names, they were actually from Venice, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, if you went back and did a kind of biographical whatever, we would find this. But I'm just curious. In other words, it's like I'm longing for a kind of anthropological supplement
mm-hmm.
to the artistic discourse,
mm-hmm.
right? Because the impression that inevitably gets made by all this is, with the kinds of dialectics that have been discussed, is of course that if you leave something as it is, it stays there, which is not true. Buildings fall down, right? Or going back to that bombing map, right? If something gets bombed, then you make the choice. Do you build something new, or do you reconstruct?
Mm-hmm.
And then where does the money come from,
mm-hmm.
right? And so I'm just curious about very basic things like what are the regulations in Venice for preservation?
Mm-hmm.
Where does the money, is Rome, is the central government very much interested in keeping Venice as this kind of a showcase? Is there a very, very kind of democratic feeling on the part of Venetians? Yes, we want to stay this way. I'm just curious what
Okay.
you might have come across
Right.
in that nuts and bolts kind of
Right. So obviously a lot of, well, not the stuff about where the money is coming from necessarily, but a lot of all this backstory is in my book, which is only almost 500 pages long, because of my desire to actually have a dialogic account of what's happening that isn't only about the artistic projections onto Venice. So a lot of that is there. And the fact is that Marinetti is, for example, and Ruskin both are responding to acts of the Venetian municipality that they disagree with. So at the time that Ruskin was writing Stones of Venice, the San Marco's facade was being restored. Like different parts of the facade were being restored. And well, not to go into that whole story, but it was Ruskin's idea that the scars of history needed to remain there, and that to reconstruct in the way that Notre Dame had been reconstructed was to essentially do wrong by history. And so Ruskin, actually, his activism now is seen as a very precious moment in the cultural history of Venice by the Venetians themselves, because he managed to save one of the original mosaics from the facade, working with locals. So he was actually instrumental in changing the way that restoration takes place in Italy now. It's completely different from the way it had been in the mid-19th century. Marinetti has his polemic because there is this phrase in Venice, com'era dov'era, to reconstruct as it was, where it was. And this has been applied to a number of iconic buildings, most recently the Teatro La Fenice, the Venetian Opera House, which was rebuilt exactly as it had been, and that was a lost opportunity for many Venetians, including these architects and architectural historians and theorists who worked at the IUAV that I was just talking about, who would have advocated for a more radical, somehow reconfiguration, but the Venetian municipality tends to make very conservative decisions about the rebuilding of Venice and to favor things that sort of kind of look like you know, a kind of Venetian Gothic over and over again. So there's much more to be said, and then now there's the difficulty that you know, of course, the central government and the Venetian government has everything to invest in keeping Venice exactly as it is, because it brings in more tourism revenue that way. Now the tides might shift at a certain point, and every once in a while someone wants to build a tower, like Pierre Cardin wanted to build a tower on the mainland, and there was so much public outcry. Rem Koolhaas wanted to put the first elevators in Venice, and he is still going to do it, but he's going to hide them. They were going to be in the middle of the courtyard. Now they're going to be hidden behind an arcade. There's so much to be said on that, but just to say that, yeah, these artists are actually not completely aloof, and that is why I'm working on them, as opposed to, I was sort of writing against the vein of Thomas Mann, who becomes more and more interesting to me every time that I read him. But I was really trying to rebuke that treatment of Venice as a complete fairy projection, you know, whether dystopian or utopian.
We have time for one more question.
Thanks. The opening with references to Marinetti, who wrote, as far as I know, in Italian and French, but not in Venetian dialect, just made me think about where, if anywhere, the role of the sort of the singularity of Venetian dialect comes into play in your analyses of the city. And I think building on Tom's question as well, you know, the Venetian people, when they speak, how they speak, and how that plays at all into those questions. And then a second related question, which I think building on Jonathan's, would you subscribe to or resist or somewhere in between seeing the dynamics of Venice that you've articulated as working synecdochally for all of Italy, or really just uniquely for Venice, in terms of sort of being on the margins of modernity without being on its remote periphery or in its center?
Right. Okay. Well, as to the first question, Marinetti tries to put a little bit of Venetian dialect in this book that I'm translating now, which actually fascinates me. And I have a little bit of it, a tiny little bit of it in my book. Ezra Pound's also kind of, sort of working with a dialect that's maybe Ligurian and maybe Venetian. We don't really know, but he was interested in that. We know that. I mean, he was also trying to mimic African American dialect of the soldiers at Pisa. And so it's sort of a thread, but it doesn't really get focused on until the end of my book, where I talk about Andrea Zanzotto's work with neo-dialect poetry, which comes out of a collaboration with Federico Fellini for Casanova, in which Fellini commissioned Zanzotto to write in a kind of fantastic Venetian dialect. And I think that poetry is fantastically interesting, and so there is. I have a deep interest in dialect, but I'm by no means an expert on Venetian dialect or the dialect of the Veneto. And so I try to write about the way that Zanzotto both invents the dialect and taps into this, this living history that's kind of flowing through the dialect, which he compares to a kind of milkiness of the people of the Veneto. The second question, I do think that one can extrapolate from what I'm doing here, at least methodologically speaking, and because Italy is a kind of internal other to Europe. It's one of many. When you go and think about it, who is this Europe, this like Western civilization? It boils down to just a couple of examples that we somehow only now are beginning to provincialize. And so I do, obviously the dialectic between stone and water and the archipelago, that's somewhat unique to Venice, but I am doing this partly because I am an advocate for looking at these margins and trying to figure out how our entire, how our representation of literary and aesthetic artifacts needs to be recast when you just shift your perspective to these margins. And I also, although I never tend to say, I work on literature and architecture, which is now suddenly becoming a thing, but that has been a very important for me throughout the development of this project. I've just become more and more convinced that the literature needs to be placed into context of the actual ambient that it's trying to respond to. And I think that in Italy there are so many amazing spaces that have inflected the writing of native authors as well as authors coming from afar, and that there's much more to be done. And I hope that this can kind of inspire others to take up that kind of challenge as well.
Well, please join me in thanking Jennifer Specter.